Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. Picture this. A girl turns to look at you over her shoulder. Her lips are slightly parted, as if she's about to say something. Her eyes lock into yours, and hanging from her ear is an enormous pearl. A pearl so big, it probably shouldn't even exist. You've seen her. Everyone has. She's on posters, coffee mugs, tote bags, and at least one very good film starring Scarlett Johansson. She's been called the Mona Lisa of the North. And here's the thing, though. She isn't real. She never was. And that pearl? Almost certainly a fake. Welcome to the strange, luminous world of Johannes Vermeer, a painter who produced barely 36 paintings in his entire life, died broke at 43, and somehow left us the most intimate window we have into the richest nation on earth. Today, I'm going Delft. So let's start this with a number, 35, maybe 37, depending on which art historian you ask. And trust me, they all argue about it. That's how many Vermeer paintings survive in total. His entire life's work would fit comfortably on the walls of a modest house. Let me put that another way. Fewer Vermeers survive than there are Beatles songs. Considerably fewer. You know, the Beatles actually recorded over 200 songs. And here's the truly mad part. If every surviving Vermeer somehow came up for sale tomorrow, there probably isn't enough money in the entire global art market to actually buy them all. Each one is effectively beyond price because there will never be another. So compare that to his contemporaries. Rembrandt left us hundreds of paintings and thousands of drawings. Some Dutch painters of the era were churning out canvases the way factories churn out biscuits. Vermeer? 2, maybe 3 paintings a year, and that would be in a very good year. So he was born in Delft in 1632, and he died there in 1675. He barely left the place. As far as we know, he never traveled abroad, he never painted a king, he never chased fame in Amsterdam. He ran an art dealership he'd inherited from his father. He married a woman named Katharina, had somewhere between 11 and 15 children. Records are a little bit fuzzy, but either way, that's a lot of children. And he painted slowly, obsessively, and I have to say, very beautifully. And Delft itself gave him one hell of a backdrop. In October 1654, when Vermeer was 22, a gunpowder magazine in the middle of the town actually exploded, and they still call it today the Delft Thunderclap. It flattened a quarter of the city, killed over 100 people, and among the dead was Karel Fabritius, Rembrandt's most gifted student, the man who'd painted the Goldfinch, and quite possibly the most talented painter in Delft. Some historians have wondered whether Fabritius's death cleared the stage for a young local named Vermeer. Look, we'll never know, but it's a chilling thought. One of art history's greatest careers might have actually opened with that explosion. And during his lifetime, he was fine, I think. He was locally respected. He was bought by a small circle of Delft collectors, never wealthy, never celebrated. When he died, he left Katharina buried in debt, and for 200 years, the world more or less forgot that he existed. Which raises the obvious question for me, how does a slow, broke, forgotten painter from a mid-sized Dutch town end up as one of the most beloved artists in human history? To answer that, we need to talk about money, serious money, because Vermeer had the extraordinary luck, and it was luck, to be born into the greatest economic boom the world has ever seen. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic, this small, soggy, kind of newly independent patch of Northern Europe, half of it below sea level, became the richest nation on earth. Not one of the richest, the richest. Amsterdam actually took Venice's crown as the commercial capital of Europe. Dutch ships carried more cargo than the ships of England, France, Spain, and Portugal combined. And at the center of this whole astonishing machine sat one organization, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. And I did recently just complete a 2-part podcast on them. So if you want to go into them in detail, then just refer back to those 2 other podcasts. But for those of you who haven't actually listened to them, the VOC was the world's first true multinational corporation. It was the first company to issue publicly traded shares. Ordinary people can actually walk into Amsterdam and buy a piece of it, which is essentially the birth of the modern stock market. It paid dividends. It had a logo. It built a global supply chain that stretched from Japan to Indonesia to India to Sri Lanka and the southern tip of Africa. Its ships literally came home groaning with spices, silk, tea, porcelain, sugar, and of course coffee. Nutmeg from the Banda Islands, pepper from India, blue and white china from Jingaden. Things Europeans had barely tasted, touched, or seen, suddenly stacked on the docks of Amsterdam. And the profits actually flooded back into Dutch society and changed absolutely everything, including, crucially for our story, art. And here's why. For most of European history, if you wanted to make a living as a painter, you needed a patron, a king, a pope, a duke, someone basically with a castle and an ego. And those patrons wanted paintings of themselves, their battles, and of course their saints. But in the Dutch Republic, something new happened. For perhaps the first time in European history, the people buying paintings weren't aristocrats. They were merchants and lawyers and doctors and ship owners, ordinary but prosperous people who wanted something lovely to hang above the fireplace. Art became a middle-class luxury, and the scale of it's hard to believe. Historians estimate that over the course of the 17th century, Dutch painters produced literally millions of paintings. Millions. Butchers owned paintings. Bakers owned paintings. There are accounts of foreign visitors being genuinely baffled that Dutch farmers actually had art on their walls. And when your customer is a cheese merchant rather than a cardinal, you don't paint the martyrdom of, Saint Sebastian. You paint what cheese merchants love, their world. Kitchens, music lessons, taverns, letters arriving, sunlight falling through a window onto a tiled floor. This was the world that Vermeer stepped into, and he became, I think, its supreme master. So let's go back to the beginning. The Girl with the Pearl Earring, which was painted around 1665. After the Mona Lisa, she may just be the most famous painted face in the world. And almost everything about her is a mystery. So let me start with this. She isn't a portrait. Most historians agree she's not a real, identifiable person at all. The Dutch had a word for this kind of picture, a trone. And a trone is a study of a face, an expression, a costume, a character piece, if you like. Think of it as an actor playing a role rather than a person sitting for a photograph. So who is she? Nobody and everybody. And I think that's rather Vermeer's point. So why is she so captivating? So why does this one face, out of the millions of faces painted in the 17th century, stop people dead in museum corridors some 400 years later? Vermeer, I think, makes a handful of quietly brilliant choices. She's turning, kind of caught mid-movement, as if someone just called her name. Her lips are slightly parted. They're moist, catching the light, as if she's drawing breath to speak. And that's not an accident. Vermeer painted the split second before speech. And our brains, which are wired for conversation, lean in to hear what's coming. That's why people stand in front of her feeling absurdly that they're actually being spoken to. Then there are her eyes. Look closely and you'll see two tiny points of white. Catch lights, painters call them. one in each eye. They're minuscule. Remove them, and she dies on the canvas. With them, her eyes are wet, they're alive, lit by the same window that lights her face. And she's looking directly at you. Neuroscientists have actually shown that direct eye contact triggers one of the strongest responses the human brain produces. It fires up the region that handles attention, emotion, and social connection. Whether the gaze comes from a person or a painting, it doesn't matter. Vermeer knew nothing about neuroscience. He just understood centuries early exactly which levers to pull. Now the oddities. She has no eyelashes. None that you can see anyway. For years, people wondered whether that was deliberate. Part of what makes her face so smooth, so mask-like, so universal, I suppose. Then in 2018, researchers at the Mauritshuis put her under microscopes and scanners for a project they called The Girl in the Spotlight, and discovered Vermeer did paint eyelashes, tiny, delicate hairs, now so faded they're actually invisible to the naked eye. The same scans actually revealed something even better. The famous black background, it's not black at all. Vermeer originally painted her in front of a glossy dark green curtain, complete with folds. Over 3.5 centuries, the pigments degraded and the curtain simply vanishes into darkness. The stark, floating, timeless quality that we so admire, well, it's partly an accident of chemistry. Time itself has been quietly editing this painting. And notice what the darkness does. There's nothing else to look at. No room, no furniture, no story. Just her. Most 17th century portraits feel frozen. Stiff collars, stiff faces, people posing, I suppose, for posterity. She doesn't feel frozen at all. She actually feels alive. It's an astonishingly modern image, which is exactly why she works on a tote bag in 2026. Now the pearl. Let me just ruin the pearl for you. If you look closely at it, you'll notice it's enormous, implausibly so. Many scholars actually believe no natural pearl that size could ever exist. And what she's actually wearing is polished glass, coated to shine like a pearl. Costume jewelry, if you like. A prop. Look even closer, and you'll see it's barely painted at all. 2 or 3 deft strokes. A bright highlight, I think, soft reflection on her collar. It doesn't even have a hook connecting it to her ear. It floats. And this is the best bit, your brain then does the rest. Does it matter? I don't think so, because the pearl isn't there to be a pearl. It's there to be a symbol of purity, of wealth, of exotic luxury. And here's where our 2 stories click together. Real pearls actually reached Europe through exactly the same global trade networks that made the Dutch rich. When a Delft viewer looked at that earring, they were looking at the glamour of Asia, delivered by ship. Same goes for the blue and yellow turban. This isn't Dutch clothing. No girl in Delft walked around dressed like that. It actually reflects Europe's fascination with what they called the Orient. The textiles, the dyes, the fabrics pouring in from India, Persia, and Indonesia on VOC vessels. Vermeer wasn't trying to depict the East accurately. I think he was borrowing its costume to create a mystery. An ordinary Dutch girl, or no girl at all, dressed in the wardrobe of empire. Now to my favorite, my absolute favorite, which was painted around 1658 to 1660, the Milkmaid. Describe it in one sentence and it sounds like nothing. A kitchen servant pours milk from a jug into a bowl, and that's pretty much it. That's the painting. And yet, stand in front of it in the Rijksmuseum, and something strange happens. This ordinary act starts to feel almost sacred. Why? Because of what Vermeer does, and just as importantly, what he refuses to do. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. a community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Servants in 17th century art were usually played for laughs, or worse. They were painted as comic figures or as objects of desire. Vermeer actually refused all of it. His Milkmaid isn't romanticized. She isn't sexualized either. She's simply shown with complete, unhurried dignity. And the attention I think that he pays to her is extraordinary. Every crumb of the bread on the table, every crack and nail hole in the bare wall behind her, every fold of her rolled up sleeves, all of it's painted with the same devotion another artist might actually reserve for a queen's jewels. The message, I think, never spoken but impossible to miss, is honest work has its own noble quality. Then there's the milk itself. Look at the thin white stream falling from the jug. Vermeer has done something almost impossible. He's frozen a fleeting second and made it feel absolutely eternal. Art historians compare the painting to meditation, and I think they're absolutely right. It asks you to slow down, to find beauty in the completely ordinary. And for those who like a hidden layer, there is one. On the second floor behind her sits a foot warmer, and in the skirting tiles you can just make out little cupids. In Dutch painting, these were winking references to love and desire, temptation sitting right there in the corner of the room. And the Milkmaid? Well, she ignores them entirely. Her attention belongs completely to her work. Discipline, if you like, triumphs over temptation in, I think, the very quietest way imaginable. So how did he do it? How does a man make milk and bread and bare plaster glow like that? Well, the answer is light. Vermeer understood something photographers wouldn't formally discover for another 2 centuries, that light isn't simply something that lets us see a subject. Light is the subject, the woman, the jug, the wall. In a sense, they're all just surfaces for light to land on, and it's the light that he's really painting. And look, there may have been a tool involved. Many historians believe Vermeer experimented with a camera obscura, a darkened box or room that actually projects the outside world upside down onto a surface. Whether he actually painted from it, it's still hotly debated, and he almost certainly didn't trace. But it may explain some of his signature effects. That extraordinary photographic softness, the slightly blurred highlights, those little globes of light on the bread and the milkmaid's basket that look, for all the world, like an out-of-focus photograph. If he did use one, it makes him something remarkable. A man painting like a camera 200 years before photography existed. Now, let me be clear about something, because it's a question people reasonably ask. Did the Dutch East India Company pay Vermeer? Was he on the corporate payroll, 17th century style? The answer is no. The connection, I think, is bigger and more interesting than that. The VOC didn't fund Vermeer. It funded the world that made Vermeer possible. Its profits actually created that broad class of wealthy merchants. Those merchants wanted elegant townhouses, fine furniture, Persian carpets, imported porcelain, and, of course, paintings. Thousands upon thousands of paintings. An art market, if you like, on a scale that Europe had never seen, supported not by courts and churches, but by private buyers. And look closely at Vermeer's interiors, and you'll see the global economy sitting right there on the furniture. Chinese porcelain on the table, Turkish carpets, far too precious for the floor, so the Dutch actually draped them over tables. Exotic textiles and maps. You know, Vermeer loved painting maps on walls, and those maps showed the world as the Dutch were coming to know it, expanding, charitable, ownable. Those quiet rooms are actually the inventories of empire. Even his paint was imported. You know, the glowing blue you see in the milkmaid's apron and the girl's turban, That's ultramarine, ground from lapis lazuli, a stone mined in the mountains of Afghanistan and carried west along the ancient trade routes. In Vermeer's day, it actually cost more than gold. Most painters saved it for the Virgin Mary's robes, if they used it at all. Vermeer, a man permanently short of money, slathered it on kitchen scenes. He even mixed it invisibly into shadows and whitewashed walls to make the light shimmer. And it's one of the reasons why his rooms glow the way they do. And it's also one of the reasons that he died in debt. The man literally painted with treasure. And here I need to be honest, because this story has a shadow, and pretending otherwise would be a disservice to it. The Dutch Golden Age was built on remarkable commercial innovation, but also on colonial conquest, monopolies enforced by extreme violence, and systems of forced labor across parts of Asia and beyond. You know, the nutmeg trade alone involved atrocities in the Band Islands that are genuinely hard to read about. The wealth that filled those serene Delft interiors was in part extracted at terrible human cost thousands of miles away. So both things are true at once. The light in Vermeer's windows is real. So is the darkness in the supply chain that actually paid for those houses whose windows belong to. Any honest telling of the Golden Age actually holds both. And of course, when the boom ended, it took Vermeer with it. In 1672, a year the Dutch still call the Rampiar, the Year of Darkness, the Republic was invaded by France and attacked by England and also two German states, all at once. The economy collapsed overnight. And here's the thing about paintings. When war arrives, nobody buys them. The art market, that glorious, unprecedented market of millions of canvases, well, it simply stops. Vermeer, remember, was also an art dealer. You know, that was the family business, and the thing that actually paid for bread on his table. Suddenly, he couldn't sell his stock, and he couldn't sell his own work either. So he borrowed, and he sank. 3 years later, in December 1675, he died at just 43. Katharina later described it in heartbreaking terms. The stress of actually providing for their children with no income, she said, sent him in a day and a half from being healthy to being dead. So the Golden Age actually made Vermeer, and when it faltered, it also broke him. His widow was left settling his debts, including, famously, paying the local baker with 2 paintings, 2 Vermeers for a loaf of bread. Which brings me to what I'd argue is Vermeer's greatest achievement, and it has nothing to do with pearls or trade routes. Think about how European painters portrayed women before Vermeer. Broadly, you've got 5 options: saints, queens, mythological figures, temptresses, or decorative objects. Women effectively as a symbol, women as a prize, women as scenery. Vermeer, I think, did something radically different. He actually painted ordinary women thinking, reading letters, writing letters, making music, weighing jewelry, pouring milk, standing at a window lost in thought. Over and over, his subject is a woman's inner life, treated as if it matters, because to him, I think it actually did. And I think that places him incredibly far ahead of his time. In the 1660s, women in most of Europe couldn't actually own property independently. They weren't allowed to attend university. They certainly couldn't vote. And that last one wouldn't change for another 2.5 centuries. The idea that an ordinary woman's private thoughts were a subject worthy of serious art, it simply didn't exist in most of Europe. Painters painted what patrons valued, and patrons didn't, on the whole, value a housemaid's interior life. Vermeer quietly decided otherwise, decades, arguably centuries before European art caught up with him. When 19th century painters discovered the dignity of ordinary working lives, they were walking a path a Delft art dealer had cleared 200 years before. In paintings like Woman Reading a Letter and Lady Writing a Letter, these women were actually participants. They're not being displayed. They're actually making decisions, communicating, reflecting. They have business of their own. Who wrote the letter? A lover? A husband away at sea with the VOC? Well, we're never actually told. And the drama is entirely internal. And Vermeer trusts a woman's face, absorbed in thought, to carry an entire painting. Almost nobody else was doing that. And notice this too, the women never actually look at us. In so much art of that period, women are performing for a male audience, presented, angled, and then being offered. Vermeer's women are absorbed in their own worlds, and they couldn't actually care less that we're watching. That gives them something rare in 17th century art: autonomy. If anything, we become the intruders, glimpsing a private moment that we never really were invited into. And by treating domestic life with total artistic seriousness, by making a kitchen as significant as a palace, and a servant as worthy of attention as a noblewoman, Vermeer actually pulls off something quite revolutionary. He just didn't announce it. He just did it, canvas after canvas in the silence of those Delft rooms. Now, you'd probably think this is where the story ends. Painter dies broke, world moves on. But Vermeer's afterlife might be the strangest chapter of all, because for 2 centuries, he vanished. His paintings didn't disappear. They hung on walls, they were sold at auctions, passed through estates, but his name disappears. Works were actually misattributed to other painters. If you like, he kind of became a footnote. Then in 1881, at an auction in The Hague, a small grubby painting of a girl in a turban came up for sale. It was in terrible condition. It sold for 2 guilders and 30 cents, plus the buyer's premium. That's the girl with the pearl earring. Today, she's the pride of the art world and effectively priceless. So 2 guilders, and I think it remains one of the greatest bargains in human history. The man who actually brought Vermeer back was a French journalist and art critic, Theophile Thor Berger, who stumbled across Vermeer's view of Delft in the 1840s and became, in his own words, obsessed. He then spent years crisscrossing Europe, hunting down every canvas he could attribute to his Sphinx of Delft. And by the 1860s, he'd published a catalogue that resurrected Vermeer's reputation. Within a generation, the forgotten Delft painter was being spoken of alongside Rembrandt. And then came the price of fame: forgery. And this is one of the best stories in all of art history, I think. In the 1930s and 40s, a very bitter, failed Dutch painter named Han van Meegeren started producing lost Vermeers. And he was good, frighteningly good. He baked his canvases to crack the paint, used period materials, and invented an entire early religious phase of Vermeer's career that scholars had theorized might just exist. The experts then fell over themselves to authenticate them. Museums paid fortunes. And one of his fakes, a painting called Christ with the Adulteress, ended up in the private collection of Hermann Göring. Yes, that's Hermann Göring. The Nazi Reichsmarshal traded well over 100 looted paintings to get his hands on what he believed was a genuine Vermeer. After the war, Dutch investigators actually traced the sale back to Van Meegeren, and they arrested him for treason. Selling a Dutch national treasure to the Nazis, well, that's a capital offense, and he actually faced the death penalty. His defense? It's not treason, it's a fake, and I painted it myself. Nobody believed him. So, under guard in front of witnesses, Van Meegeren painted one final Vermeer to prove that he actually could. And it worked. The treason charge collapsed. He was convicted only of forgery, and he actually died a few weeks into a 1-year sentence, having become, in a poll of the day, one of the most popular men in the Netherlands, the failed painter who swindled Göring. And I think the Dutch rather loved him for it. There's a dark postscript to Vermeer's fame too. In 1990, 2 thieves dressed as police officers talked their way into the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston and walked out with 13 works of art, including Vermeer's The Concert. With only 36 Vermeers in existence, losing one is an absolute catastrophe. The concert is often called the most valuable stolen painting in the world, and more than 3 decades on, its frame still hangs empty on the museum wall waiting. It's never been found. 35 paintings, and the world still can't bear to be parted from a single one of them. So here's where we end up. Vermeer lived through a century obsessed with the extraordinary. Exploration, fortunes made and lost, ships sailing off the edge of the known map and coming back loaded with treasure. His countrymen were, quite literally, redrawing the world. And Vermeer looked at all of it and turned his easel towards a woman pouring milk. He wasn't interested in grand events. He believed the truth lived somewhere else, in ordinary moments. A girl glancing over her shoulder, a letter being read by a widow, sunlight crossing a bare wall. His paintings make one quiet, persistent argument, that the greatest mysteries might not be waiting in distant lands, but sitting right there in the silence of an ordinary room. And maybe that's why he still gets us 4 centuries on. We live surrounded by noise and speed and things demanding our attention. And here's this man from Delft saying, hey, slow down, look closer. The everyday moment in front of you, and the person in it might just hold more depth and dignity than you ever imagined. Not bad for a fellow who painted 35 pictures and died broke. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.